Hi and welcome to Philosophy with Phil, with me, Phil Cohen. For this video, I want to talk about truth and reality. And what do we mean by absolute truth? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? That there are other things that are unquestionably true in Jewish thought. And I should, before I go on, point out that yes, I know right at the beginning I did 4 videos about the key questions that have been addressed by philosophers over the years. This is undoubtedly another question that has been addressed by philosophers. The reason I didn't include it is firstly because I like to group things into 4s, as you can probably tell, but also it's kind of like a fifth that feed into the fifth, and often you'll see that when we do have groupings of 4, there is a sort of fifth that the 4 of them feed into. So it does sit above them all, and we will be pulling off 1 or 2 ideas from those videos. So there will be 2 videos in this on this topic. The second one I'll leave later on to explain what that's about, and you can watch that later. But here I want to just focus on truth and reality. So, are there things that we know to be true? Is there anything we can prove to be true? I'll start by looking at the secular approach. One of the main thrusts of philosophy over the centuries has been empiricism. The idea that reality is only as such if it can be perceived in some way through one of the 5 senses that we have, particularly through sight. So for those that are familiar with the film The Matrix, by the way, a fantastic film which raises a lot of philosophical questions, and there's a lot, very, very thought-provoking in my view. We'll be familiar with the idea of people being fed sensory stimuli, and that is what they experience of the world. It was started by Aristotle and the Stoics, his tabula rasa, and later by David Hume and George Berkeley. George Berkeley famously said, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, has it actually made a sound? In other words, if something is not perceived, is it real? Okay. Now, we'd like to think that the world carries on existing regardless of us experiencing it or perceiving it in some sensory way. But more recently, in the last 100, 120 years or so, in quantum mechanics, we've seen how observing subatomic and atomic particles has made a difference to their behaviour. And that has kind of thrown the whole philosophical arguments about reality and perception and the interrelation between the two up in the air. Anyway, back to Judaism. In Judaism, we believe, yes, there is absolute objective reality. We call it emes, truth. Emes is another name for God. And surprisingly, you won't be surprised to know that God is the ultimate reality. What I want to show is 2 different approaches to what we perceive then as the physical world as a result of that. We'll look at the Hasidic approach and the Misnagdic approach. And let me just explain those briefly. Hasidism was a kind of anti-intellectual, anti-enlightenment movement that sprung up in the 18th century. The main instigator of the movement was the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer, and his emphasis was more on doing religion, doing acts of kindness, helping others, working together with others, interpersonal, social good deeds and acts of kindness, bringing people together, and letting the sort of religion take care of itself. Yes, obviously they would advocate doing the mitzvahs and following the Torah and so on, but there was less of an emphasis on the learning and more of an emphasis on the doing. Okay. They have, some of their proponents had stories they would tell, often involving common folk. Wagon drivers often appear, innkeepers often appear in the stories. And Hasidism was very much about connecting to God through connecting with your fellow man. Now, absolutely nothing wrong with that. Absolutely not. Far be it from me to criticise that. In fact, quite the opposite. I think many of us could do with some more in that, some improvement in that line. But it was a sort of rebuttal to the scientific revolution that was going on at the time, the intellectualism that was going on at the time, as a way of appealing to a much broader spectrum of Jews. It was steeped in mysticism, and it's very often underrated in this regard. The idea that many of the deep mystics that we see in this time were absolutely what I can only call Balei Chesed. They were people that went out of their way to help others, and to ensure the welfare and the well-being of the community. Yes, they would study at home, and they would often study in secret and study deep Kabbalistic texts, but their way of expressing their Judaism was through acts of kindness. So we have the Hasidic approach, and we have the second approach is the Misnagdic approach. The Misnagdic approach mainly came from the Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman, the Vilna Gaon as he was known, and his disciples, Reb Chaim of Volozhin and so on. They wanted to bring Judaism back to the intellectual and emphasise learning of Torah and that as a way of connecting with God. It was more directed, it was more text-based. It didn't ignore the Kabbalistic aspects of the religion. In fact, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, one of the primary disciples of the Vilna Gaon, brought out Nefesh HaChaim, a book about Kabbalah, to directly address those misgivings about their strand of Judaism. But it was, nonetheless, a sort of trying to redress the balance in terms of Torah learning that it felt Hasidism was lacking. So you have these two different movements, and let's look at how they approach God and, as a result, reality. So from a Hasidic approach, to put it simply, everything is God. Okay. Anyone that's been on any Lubavitch Day camp or heard Uncle Moishy will know the song Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Okay. Well, that came about, yes, by Lubavitch, which was a strand of Hasidism, a very, very prominent strand of Hasidism. But it's there what their philosophy is that God is literally everything. They do not see a conflict between the physical world and the spiritual world. They do not hold any restrictions on the way in which God can interact with between the two. So the way they explain that is through a concept of tzimtzum. Now, going to tread carefully here because we're starting to get into very deep and metaphysical concepts. But that through the act of creation, they believe, God was able to dilute himself a little bit, almost like a donut, having a gap in a donut. Dilute himself a little bit to make way for the physical world. But he is still there within the physical world. The Misnagdic approach, on the other hand, I've heard put beautifully by Rabbi Akiva Tatz. A lot of his shiurim from the JLE are based on Reb Dessler and the Nefesh HaChaim that I've already mentioned. And he puts it like this. He gives the analogy of one of the, dare I say, old cinemas that we used to have, where you have the light shining on a film and the film projecting onto a screen. And what he says is the light of God, the film is the Torah, and the screen is what we see of the physical world, what we experience of the physical world through our senses. So, the world is animated, if you like, through God's light, through the Torah. So we can understand the world by understanding the Torah. And there are many great Kabbalists, there are those recorded in the Gemara, in the Talmud, who were able to understand the Torah and by so doing be able to manipulate the real world, what they perceive as the physical world. So so in the Misnagdic approach, God is, and it's difficult to get this without saying it wrong. God's light empowers the physical world, but the physical world is like a shadow of the spiritual world. Okay, the two work side by side. Okay, and that things that happen in the spiritual world have their counterpart down here in the physical world. Okay. Because our senses and our bodies are tuned into the physical world, we have the physical drives that are and the physical sensations that are attuned into that way of thinking. But we have a neshama, we have a soul, and I've spoken about this when we talked about free will. That is connected to the spiritual world, to the spiritual source. I hope that explains those two ideas, two different approaches. In the next video, we'll look at, sort of tangentially, about Judaism and reality.